Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, Tristen, big week for my Canadian co-host. The Toronto Blue Jays are going to the World Series.
Absolutely.
I also have baseball news to share. Not quite as big as the World Series, but go on. Basket.
Look, I'm very happy for the Mud Hens, but
Yes.
the Jays are going to the World Series for the first time in 30 years, and you know what? I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, I know you should be. So we're recording at Tuesday night for me, Wednesday morning, October 22nd for Tristen. But last night I was watching the game, and I don't know if you've been able to because of the time difference and stuff, but the George Springer home run was amazing to go up and take the lead. That was like doing it at home, and like it was very Joe Carter-esque for those of people that know that reference.
You know, I watched it yesterday over lunch, and I was immediately brought back to being, 92, 93, the Joe Carter era in Sky, the feeling of what used to be called Skydome, now Rogers Center, but just, I could remember in a like profoundly embodied way what it felt like to feel that roar of the crowd. It was amazing, and I know that's, it's kind of silly to say, but it is. There's a truth to it. There's something really amazing about the communal experience of I guess fandom, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Especially like you said, it's been 30 years, 32 years. So, it's pretty exciting. And and then you're going up against what could be kind of considered the new evil empire, I guess, with like the money they spend, the Dodgers. But I will say though, and I know we got to get moving on, but Shohei Ohtani is, I mean, Friday night he may have had the greatest baseball game of ever. He threw 6 shutout innings, 10 strikeouts, and then hit 3 home runs. I mean, it's unbelievable how good that guy is. But yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention quickly, it is fall classic time as well here in Vienna, Virginia. And the Mud Hens, we won our first playoff game last night. We play another game tomorrow night in the quarterfinals. So we're trying to keep this train rolling, and we'll see what happens. But anyways, not quite as exciting as the World Series, but we'll take it. So, and as a Cleveland sports fan, I got to take what I can get wherever I can get it. So, but anyways, what's what the listeners are really tuning in for? What's on the docket today?
Well, the series ongoing elsewhere in the world. What have we got? Well, we've got a big Ukraine update, particularly with respect to NATO's defense ministers, and ongoing discussion about will they or won't they meet Trump and Putin. As of time of recording, it sounds like not. We'll get into that. We're also going to look into political turmoil in both Cameroon and Peru, and then we're going to wrap up with a deep dive on Gaza.
All right, sounds good. So, like you said, a lot going on when it comes to like NATO and Ukraine and Russia and everything. So walk us through sort of the first part of that, like the NATO stuff from last week.
Well, there was a big NATO defense ministerial meeting last Wednesday, so that's October 16th, when the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, convened everyone to basically prepare NATO and prepare Ukraine for this coming winter. We're in yet another winter of this conflict, and things sort of grind to a halt. And the focus of this NATO ministerial seems to me to have been on drones. The EU, or at least the European Union, members of NATO are going all in on drones, and this comes as a welcome development, I think. I'll be curious to hear what you have to say to the Americans. The signals that the Europeans are stepping up, and to the White House picking up the bill. And so it was a big, important ministerial, and a lot of money was pledged. I think 2.5 billion has been pledged in this round. Ukraine was asking for 3.5 billion. So there's a lot of money being anteed up. But I think it is important to note we're still down in terms of aid by 40% year on year. So I think there's much that is relatively positive to say on that front. And, my reading is that the Kremlin will be disappointed by the outcome. There was no clear division amongst the NATO allies. There was strong rhetorical support from former Secretary of Defense, now Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth.
Which is very different from his first trip to Europe.
Absolutely. And, think of just where we were at the start of the year when the US was going to freeze arms transfers. So, I see this as a positive, or at least relatively positive development. But how do you see it?
So much the same way. And I think, one thing that's especially going to be a positive for the Trump administration, but I think ultimately for America writ large too, is the fact that we are seeing the EU and the Europeans take more of a lead on paying for arms, and that gets the US administration past that hurdle of like the domestic grievance of like spending the money for these weapons that is going to Ukraine. So the European led initiative is buying these weapons, these US weapons, and then sending them to Ukraine. So not only with the drones, that demonstrates that NATO members are sort of stepping up and purchasing things, also creating more capabilities that are not so dramatically tied to U.S. capabilities, and I think that's a big thing for the Europeans and for the Americans. So I think the lowest common denominator aspect of this too, like the fact that like there just wasn't acrimony, is also a bonus. At this point when there's with this administration and with NATO members. But not only do we not see that, but we saw actual positive things, and I think that's a good sign. But then, so that wasn't obviously the only thing that happened last week. Is a busy week in Europe world and Ukraine world. But on Thursday, President Trump had a 2-hour phone call with President Putin, and then he hosted President Zelenskyy at the White House on Friday. So Trump described the call with Putin as very productive. There weren't really any deliverables that came out of this, very much like the Alaska meeting that was earlier this year. They did say that they were going to meet in Budapest over the next few weeks, but that seems to be getting walked back at this point. And I think it's has to do with differences of understanding on what was agreed to or talked about in that phone call. So, that it literally was just announced like a few hours ago. So we'll see what happens with this, but it doesn't look like they're making Airbnb reservations at the moment. And it's also funny that they're meeting in Budapest. Listeners might be aware of that Budapest memorandum that was signed at the end of the Cold War, where Ukraine gave up their weapons for territorial sovereignty. So not a lack of irony in that destination. And then Friday, obviously, was the big meeting with Zelenskyy. And one of the big things that he had been pushing, and the chatter was about the Ukrainians getting Tomahawk missiles before this. And while that didn't happen, it wasn't as bad as the meeting earlier in the year, but it wasn't as good as the last meeting with Zelenskyy. There's reports from the Financial Times that there was actually a very heated argument. And Trump said, you've got to give up some land or, quote, be destroyed. And after the meeting, Trump noted in a social media post that he wanted the battle lines frozen in place, which is sort of a middle ground between Ukraine's position of not giving up anything and Russia's position of total, Ukrainian withdrawal from those 4 eastern regions where the Russians have troops. So, that's where we are with that meeting.
Yeah, and I think this again. It's only been a couple of hours since the meeting has definitively been called off, but I think that Trump is feeling a bit sore after the non-event that was the Alaska meeting, and I think he is very much wanting to avoid walking away from Budapest, or what he likely would have done, walked away from Budapest empty-handed. we're hot on the Gaza ceasefire, and Trump is, you know, in terms of international diplomacy, running relatively high. Like, that's a victory. That's a win. That's an accomplishment. That's something that we can point to and be very, I think, happy about. And I think there was some, at least in my mind, an idea that this would, he would sort of take that and bring the same sort of focus and energy to Ukraine and to this proposed Budapest meeting, and sort of capitalize on the win he scored in Gaza. But I think it's just very, very clear from the Russian and American interlocutors that they're just way too far apart, and there nothing could come of the Budapest meeting. But well, I guess we'll see, right? Once again, it is crazy how much this story changes, not just every couple of weeks when you and I speak, but day to day.
Well, and depending on who the president spoke to last. So, all right, moving on. What's going on in Cameroon?
Well, on Sunday, October 12th, Cameroon held its election. We don't have the results of it yet, but Paul Biya, who is the president of Cameroon, is running for his 8th term in office. 8 terms. He is 92 years old. He is the second longest ruling head of state in the world. Now, again, he's 92 years old. It's his 8th term in office. He was, Kelly, if I'm right, you were about what, 4 and a half when he took office. I wasn't even born yet. So, there's much to say about Biya. There's much to say about this election. One of the things that I found particularly interesting about this election is sort of the story that it's telling, not just about Africa, but sort of patterns that we're seeing throughout the world, where there are serious, I think quite serious, generational divides between the ruling elite and the population of the country. Cameroon demographically is a young country. What is it? The median age is in the teens, I believe. And then you've got a president who's 92 years old. Another thing that is really interesting is Biya has been almost entirely absent throughout this entire campaign, which again sort of, at least in my mind, speaks to a profound disconnect, and also sort of what seems to me a complacency. 8th term in office, right? I mean, one thing one might do is, I don't know, call it a day and retire, right? But this was a story that that first caught your eye. What do you make of it? And how do you see this man clinging on to power, despite poor performance, not just in this election, but throughout his 7th term?
You're right. I did. There was a story in The Economist a couple weeks ago that sort of talked about this election and highlighted this issue. And you were spot on with talking about the glaring disconnect between the youth bulge in Africa and the fact that I think it's 7 of the 10 oldest leaders in the world are in Africa, and on the continent that has the lowest median age. And so there is that vast disconnect there, but it also speaks to this broader issue that's not just happening in Cameroon or in Africa, but in a lot of these other sort of states where leaders get in power and then create a system that allows them to keep winning elections. And through patrimony and corruption and these sorts of things that they build up. And we did a working group at ISD a couple years ago on corruption that really, brought this to the forefront, and gave me the ability to connect a lot of these things more broadly and see the role that corruption really plays in this, whether or not it's through, kickbacks and bribes and the powerful interests in Cameroon, but also other African countries have to the ruling powers, and that then, you over time are able to influence the courts and get your people on the courts and in the banks and even the electoral commissions, so that you can make a quote democratic election look legitimate. And so it's this, but at the same time, because your regime and government is basically rotten at the core, because they're all about paying off the powerful interests in themselves, and they're looking out for themselves other than the people they're governing, then governance doesn't work well, right? And this closed system makes it very hard for anyone in society to lift themselves up. And I think because you've got this disconnect where you've got these older, out of touch leaders, you've got this huge youth bulge in Africa writ large, but especially countries like Cameroon. And you have these, humongous patronage networks that are keeping these people in power. Something's got to give at some point, right? Because you are having huge demographic shifts. People want to be able to lift themselves up, but they can't when people like Biya remain in power. And nothing's changing for the moment, but I think this is definitely something that speaks to a larger trend, what's going on in Cameroon right now, and is something that we need to watch very closely in the coming years.
Absolutely. And was it only 2 weeks ago we were talking about Nepal, and we were talking about, the organization of the younger generation politically, principally by means of social media, rising up to voice their discontent about straightforward, really fundamental governance issues. And, this context, the context of Cameroon, seems ripe for that sort of a similar phenomenon to present itself. One of the things I was reading about actually just last night is the Biya has spent in total during his presidency 4 years in Geneva, away from the country. And during the election itself, he called the election or announced his candidacy on online, and then again returned to Geneva. And so it's just, I sort of point to that as being profoundly emblematic of a disconnect between the ruling elite and the citizenry, and also then this patrimonialism, this dare I say kleptocracy in action. And well, we'll see what the result of the election is, but I'm willing to guess I know who wins.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But and real quick too, it also reminds me when talking about these people are in office and then remain there to enrich themselves and their cronies. And I remember when we did the corruption working group. Do you know who the richest woman in Africa is? It's Isabel dos Santos, who is the daughter of Angola's former president. So, yeah, wonder how she made all that money.
I'm sure by perfectly legitimate means.
Yeah, of course. Yes. So, all right. Moving on to other electoral issues. Now we're going to talk about Peru. So President Dina Boluarte of Peru was impeached on October 9th, owing mostly to widespread anger over crime and, again, corruption. So Peru has now sworn in a new president, Jose Herri, and he is promising to crack down on crime. And this all sort of kicked off with a gang shooting that happened at a popular concert in Lima, while lawmakers were already trying to impeach the president. And this was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back and pushed things over the line. Wasn't all that difficult, seeing as her approval rating was at about 5%, earning her the label, not surprisingly, of the most unpopular leader in the world. It's hard to do worse than 5%. And just a little bit broader context here. This isn't the first time this has happened in Peru. There is a habit of impeachment of folks for, quote, moral incapacity, which can be done by a single vote of 2/3 in the parliament. And this has been used or threatened in nearly every presidency for over a decade at this point. So, again, like we talked about with the Cameroon issue, where it was speaking to a broader issue writ large. There's been a lot of political turnover in South America recently. A lot of it's tied to crime and the growing crime wave, and corruption. So, Tristan, where do you see this fitting in?
Well, I think it's perfectly congruent with what we're seeing across a number of South American countries, where we see Latin American and Southern American voters responding to rises, surges in crime rates. Just looking at Peru, since the last election in 2021, the crime rate has surged. Now, in that election in 2021, Pedro Castillo was elected, and he was removed a year later in 2022 by impeachment by the same measure. We've got a flourishing drug trade in Peru. There are extortion gangs that are prevalent. You've got a surge in migration from Venezuela. And so basically you've got this real cocktail of causes of crime that is not just obviously a problem, but obviously a really big concern. And this is driving politics. And so here we have Heri. He's a conservative coming to power. He's asking for extraordinary policing powers. And I think it's worth making a comparison here to Bukele. Many have argued that he is an authoritarian, and he's very popular. And also I think we should note this is somebody who is under open investigation for charges of rape. And so politics right now in Lima are as fast moving, shall we say, as ever, and I don't see them slowing down with Heri coming to power. And already at least one person has been shot dead in the last couple of days since he took office. So we'll see if his election marks a changing point, a turning point, or if this is just one further conflagration, not just in Peru, but one more incidence of this sort of thing happening in South America.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is. It's just, again, it's so interesting talking about the Cameroon issue and then the Peru issue and seeing them as these are microcosms of broader things that we're seeing around these regions. And, this right-wing turn that's very popular in South America and Latin America because of the growing gang violence and crime and this harsh crackdown. And, we've talked about it before, like, yes, it's giving these extreme powers to these presidents, and they're cracking down, and sometimes innocent people are getting caught up in these arrests and imprisoned. But at the same time, if you're, somebody that's trying to make a living and has a family and young kids and things like that, like, you just want it to be safe. And, that's especially when it's as bad as it is in some of these places. So it's hard to figure out a middle ground, right? It's hard to find a middle ground that deals with the crime, but also doesn't give your president authoritarian powers.
Yeah, absolutely. And look at sort of the structural comparison between Cameroon and Peru, where you've got a political system that is in Cameroon that is engineered to maintain continuity, to keep the ruling elite and in particular this president Biya in power. And then in Peru, you have things engineered in exactly the opposite way, or at least they've been turned that way, such that it has become the norm that if you get elected into office, like, hit the clock, it's only a matter of time before you're impeached.
Yeah, and again, that middle ground between continuity and turnover also needs to be worked out as well. So, it highlights that, good governance, it can be very hard. And I think we take that for granted sometimes. So you mentioned earlier some of the Gen Z protests that we have talked about lately. And we talked about Madagascar in our last episode. So, what's the quick update for our listeners on Madagascar?
Yeah, so what we covered in our last episode was that the Gen Z or Gen Z protests over again, straightforward governance issues, lack of power, blackouts, water outages. Well, this has tipped into a full-blown coup. An elite military faction broke with the president. They refused to fire on demonstrators, and they moved to dissolve state institutions after the National Assembly voted for impeachment. The president, Rayoelina, he fled the country, reportedly under a deal with French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, the colonel who was in leading things in this coup, he's now been sworn in as the president, leading a military-led transition that could run, anywhere from a year and a half to a full 2 years before elections. And I think it's worth noting that this echoes Rayoelina's own army-backed rise back in 2009. Now, reactions appear mixed from the public. But the new president does appear to be trying to respond to their demands. And his first act was to announce an investigation into the state-run water and power company. So when military coups happen, new leaders tend to try to hold on to power rather than deliver on the promises that they made in elections. We might have seen the downside of these youth-led protests here without a clear leader among them. Remember when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, we talked about one of the defining features of these protests, of these movements, is that they are leaderless, that they are decentralized. And where you've got a decentralized movement, it does make conditions ripe for then an organization where there's a very clear power hierarchy to come in and capitalize on it. And it seems to me that's what we've got in Madagascar.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see not only what happens in Madagascar and how this turns out, but do these Gen Z protests continue to spread to other places? Because as we've talked about just today, there's lots of places that are experiencing the same sorts of grievances. So, will this spread or not is something we'll be watching on this little show in the coming months. All right, Tristen, good talking to you as always. And I can't say this strongly enough. Go Blue Jays. All right, so that ends our news roundup, and we now move to our conversation on Gaza with Mona Yacoubian. Mona is Director and Senior Advisor of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She has more than 30 years of experience working on the Middle East and North Africa, with a focus on conflict analysis and stabilization, including in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Libya. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Headlines in History, and I'm excited to be joined once again today. I'm not sure if this is her third or fourth appearance on the podcast, but Mona Yacoubian is back with us today to discuss the ongoing ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and Israel. Mona, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me, Kelly. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
So I will preface before we start our line of questioning here that we are recording this at about lunchtime on Tuesday, October 21st, and this podcast will come out Thursday morning, October 23rd. So who knows what will happen between now and then in the roughly 42 hours between now and when this podcast comes out. So anyway, so I mentioned the ceasefire, and there's going to be continued negotiations because this thing has been built with phases built in. But, as of right now, with the early phases of the ceasefire, what has actually changed? What's going on the ground?
Well, most importantly, though, I'm glad you're mentioning the date, is a quieting of hostilities. I wouldn't say a total cessation. We actually saw a pretty harrowing escalation on Sunday of an attack and by militants on the ground and then airstrikes. But in general, quieter. an ability on the ground for Palestinians in Gaza to begin to return to whatever is remains of their homes or the rubble that is their homes, as well as flowing in, although that too is not going at quite the pace that people would like to see, of humanitarian aid. We've also, of course, I mean, you asked me on the ground, so I did not reference the obvious, which is the return of all hostages alive back to Israel, and also the return of remains of deceased hostages. There, I think the count now might be up to 13 or 14 or 15, somewhere around there. Still some number to be returned back to Israel, and that is a critical part of phase one of the ceasefire agreement.
Yeah, and I saw in your point to the conflict that went on Sunday and the attack by Hamas and the response by Israeli forces, that Hamas has been careful to, distance itself from those activities, like the Hamas leadership, basically saying these were some guys on the ground that we didn't tell them to do this, to try to keep this ceasefire going. But one of the things I think that was, I don't know, important, key, shocking to some people was the level of pressure, it seems like, that President Trump put on Netanyahu to agree to this ceasefire. So how do you see that relationship right now? And, what do you think Trump did there?
Well, it is critical, I think. It was a critical element in getting us to yes on this agreement. I think it started with the September 9th Israeli strikes on Doha, which I would argue were a catalyzing event. I mean, it shocked and stunned not only the Qataris, but also President Trump and the Trump administration. And by all accounts, including by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner themselves directly noting that this was a critical event that led them to believe that perhaps the Israelis had gone too far, and this was really a moment to exercise leverage. And so I think that is critical, and it's important today. We're speaking today when Vice President Vance is in Israel. And I think that is also important because the question of the U.S. exercising its pressure on Israel is not one that's going to go away. So we're seeing that Vance is in Israel in part because there's concern that Prime Minister Netanyahu may actually withdraw from the strikes on Sunday, where the Israelis initially said that they were going to halt all humanitarian assistance, and it felt like that was an open-ended halt. And in fact, it was U.S. pressure reportedly that led that to be a temporary pause and the resumption of aid on Monday. And so I think this role of the U.S. and the unique role it can play in leveraging its influence with Israel is going to be important, not just now, but in the days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a key point is that, the president tends to sort of, helicopter into things from now and then they focus their attention back to Ukraine, like we've seen in the last week or other places. But this is something that's going to need very sustained, continued leverage pressure from the United States on Israel, but also on our Gulf partners on Hamas as well. So definitely going to need sustained activity on the part of the U.S. But back to the on-the-ground situation. And one of the other key aspects of the agreement was the creation of this international force to kind of go in as a security force in Gaza. That hasn't happened yet, obviously, and who knows what's going to happen with that. But that there obviously is some sort of power vacuum in Gaza at the moment, and we've seen Hamas in some aspects trying to reassert itself. We've seen them, kill and murder some political opponents over the weekend and things like that. So, who is trying to fill that vacuum right now during this time period where we don't have that security force yet?
Well, I think it for sure Hamas is trying to reassert itself. We've seen where in places where the Israelis have withdrawn, we see Hamas coming back in. in certain instances doing more benign things like directing traffic, but we've also seen clashes and so forth. And I think at the top of our discussion, you referenced kind of the chaotic environment on the ground in Gaza. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that there are gangs, criminal gangs, there are rival clans, various opponents to Hamas. I think you're seeing all of these various armed elements seek to assert themselves, as we do in any conflict situation. When a security vacuum opens up, all the different armed elements that are in there are going to seek to elbow their way in. I think that is exactly what we're watching in Gaza. I think that is part of the problem, though, with respect to the security arrangements on the ground. How is it that Hamas is going to be disarmed in that environment? Who's going to do it? It's not going to be the International Stabilization Force. That was not the purpose of that force. And so who is going to do it, especially in this kind of chaotic environment that we see unfolding in Gaza?
So that's a great segue to my next question, is the fact that, in many aspects, the as hard as it was to get a ceasefire, that was, when you look at the other points to this, that was the easy part. You mentioned disarming Hamas. Like, no armed group like Hamas wants to disarm, right? Because they're losing that power that they do have if they do that, especially if they're trying to go against other armed gangs and rivals and clans and things like that. So, what are some of the other tripping points in this as we look ahead to different phases and different parts of the negotiation? And have we even begun those, like, phase 2 negotiations yet?
No, we're not in phase 2. As I said, we're seeing the wobbling of phase 1, and that still needs to be solidified. Absolutely, it's the disarming of Hamas, the demilitarization of Gaza as laid down in the 20-point plan. It's the issues around security arrangements, governance, and we can talk about that, and also kind of early recovery and then reconstruction. There's sort of that three-legged stool of security, governance, and assistance or reconstruction that needs to be established in order for Gaza to stabilize. I would argue that we don't have any of those legs yet built.
So, so are we going to see Tony Blair leading Gaza? What is the thought process? Let's go into that a little bit on the political aspect of it, because we haven't touched on that yet too, because that is such a huge part of this, down the road, obviously. But what's the thought process on that?
Well, it's not clear how much thought actually has gone into this, because I think the points as laid down, or the point that's laid down in the 20-point agreement, is pretty vague. It references the need for a transitional, I think, committee comprised of technocrats, and that is very purposeful. Obviously, not Hamas, that's clear. Hamas will have no governance role, but also no Palestinian Authority at this time will have a governance role. So that leaves technocrats. And the issue here is which technocrats, how credible are they? Do they have legitimacy on the ground? Are they Gazan? Are they based in Gaza? And then the point also kind of notes this board of peace, so-called, with President Trump as its chairman, and then this elevated role for former Prime Minister Blair. Not at all clear how that all goes down. What kind of authority would he have, if any? Where would he be based? And Kelly, you talk about this kind of over the horizon, but in effect, to stabilize Gaza, these governance elements have to be put into place pretty soon. Governance, hand in hand with security, is going to be critical, even in the early days of some kind of quote unquote day after plan for Gaza. And so I think we're still a long way from that. Certainly haven't heard names or the formal structure or what kind of authorities these folks will have on the ground, let alone how they'll be empowered and enabled to actually do the very, very hard work of trying to help a fairly devastated Gaza get back on its feet again.
hmm You've mentioned a couple key points to this process, and looking over the horizon a little bit, as you noted, in the next few months, assuming that the ceasefire holds, which is as we noted, somewhat of a stretch. Assuming that it does hold, what are some of the key sort of signposts that we should be watching for in November, in December, and early into next year?
So I think we need to, of course, see the continued return of the remains of deceased hostages. That's a critical element. I think also critical is going to be the opening of various crossings into Gaza, particularly in Rafah, which is a critical element to Gaza recovery. We are not seeing humanitarian assistance come in at the scale that is needed. So we'll want to see the opening of crossings. We're going to want to see, I think, some relaxation of dual use restrictions by Israel, because there are so many things that are critical for Gaza recovery that are simply not allowed in, like cement, for example, other building materials, etc. So that's going to be another key element. And then, of course, we're going to want to see some progress on these different plans, on this governance committee. We would like to perhaps see names put forward. We would probably want to see some effort at kind of beginning to establish this international stabilization force. I think we could see perhaps in the nearer future, there's talk of a UN Security Council resolution being passed. That would be the sort of legal foundation for this force. And then most importantly, Kelly, and probably most difficult, some broader sense of, again, what's the plan? What is the mechanism by which Hamas is disarmed? How is that going to happen? I think in the absence of that, we are likely to fall back into what we saw happen on this past Sunday, and sadly, I think we'll see more of in the future, which are skirmishes on the ground that then escalate into broader military action by the Israelis to put down these threats that they are seeing.
Yeah, and also gives them a reason to back away from the ceasefire if they so desire. So, all right, Mona, thank you as always. It's always great to chat, and I'm sure we'll be checking back in with you in the coming months to see where we are in Gaza. So thanks.
Thank you so much for having me, Kelly. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks again to Mona Yacoubian for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines and History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdullah Nassif. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.